Mark thought his loyal husky, Storm, was acting out of jealousy, stealing his daughter's favorite toys one by one and vanishing into the dark corners of the house. But when he finally dragged the dog out from under the bed, he didn't find a pile of chewed-up plastic. He found a terrifying secret and a desperate warning that would save his little girl's life. The silence in the house was the loudest thing Mark had ever heard. It had been 6 months since the accident that took his wife, Sarah, leaving him alone in a sprawling suburban home that felt too big, too quiet, and entirely too empty. The only sounds that filled the void now were the soft, rhythmic breathing of his 6-year-old daughter, Lily, and the heavy, clicking paws of Storm, their 3-year-old Siberian Husky. Mark sat at the kitchen island, staring into a mug of cold coffee. His eyes were rimmed with red, the exhaustion of single parenthood settling deep into his bones. He rubbed his face, trying to summon the energy to start the day. He had to be mom and dad now. He had to be strong, but mostly, he just felt tired. "Daddy?" A small, trembling voice broke his trance. Mark spun around on the stool. Lily stood in the doorway of the kitchen, her oversized pajamas trailing on the floor. Her hair was a mess of morning curls, but it was her face that broke his heart. Her lower lip was quivering, tears welling in her wide blue eyes, eyes that looked so much like Sarah's. "Hey, sweetie, what's wrong?" Mark asked, dropping to one knee and opening his arms. Lily shuffled forward and buried her face in his shoulder. "Mr. Fluffles is gone," she sobbed. "I woke up and he wasn't in my bed. I looked everywhere." Mark sighed, a mixture of frustration and sympathy bubbling in his chest. Mr. Fluffles, a raggedy, gray stuffed rabbit, was Lily's lifeline. Sarah had bought it for her just days before the crash. Lily didn't sleep without it. She didn't eat without it. It was her anchor in a world that had suddenly turned upside down. "We'll find him, Lil. Did you check under the covers?" "Yes," she sniffled. "He's gone. Storm took him. I saw him." Mark frowned. Storm? The husky was a gentle giant. He had been Sarah's pride and joy, a dog so intuitive that he would rest his head on Mark's knee before Mark even realized he was having a bad day. Storm adored Lily. He usually slept at the foot of her bed, standing guard like a furry sentinel. The idea of him taking her toy seemed absurd. "Are you sure, honey? Storm doesn't steal toys. He has his own chew ropes." "I saw him," she insisted, her voice pitching up in distress. "He had Mr. Fluffles in his mouth, and he ran away." Mark stood up, taking Lily's hand. "Okay, let's go find the culprit." They walked into the living room. There, lying innocently on his dog bed, was Storm. The husky looked up, his heterochromatic eyes, one ice blue, one warm brown, full of intelligence. He didn't look guilty. He looked calm. But as Mark got closer, he saw it, a tuft of gray fur sticking out from under the sofa cushion behind the dog. Mark reached down and pulled out the stuffed rabbit. It was damp with slobber, but otherwise unharmed. "See?" cried Lily, snatching the bunny back and hugging it tight. "He stole it!" Mark looked at the dog. "Storm, no," he said firmly, pointing a finger. "Leave it." Storm let out a low, mournful woo-woo sound, tilting his head. He didn't look ashamed. If anything, he looked agitated. He paced in a tight circle, chuffing softly, his eyes darting from Mark to Lily and back again. "He's just acting out," he muttered mostly to himself. "He misses Mom too." That became the narrative for the next week. It started with the rabbit, but it didn't stop there. On Tuesday, it was Lily's favorite blanket, the pink fleece one she used for movie nights. Mark found it stuffed haphazardly behind the washing machine in the laundry room, with Storm sitting in front of the door whining. On Thursday, it was her inhaler. That was the breaking point. Lily had mild asthma, usually triggered by seasonal allergies. Mark had torn the house apart looking for it, panic rising in his throat, only to find it buried in the backyard dirt, half covered by fresh earth. Storm had been digging furiously when Mark caught him. "What is wrong with you?" Mark had yelled, grabbing the dog's collar and pulling him back. Storm had yelped, a sound that cut Mark to the quick, but the fear for his daughter's safety outweighed his guilt. "You could have heard her. She needs this." He had banished the dog to the garage for the night, ignoring the scratching at the door and the high-pitched, desperate howls that echoed through the walls. That night, Mark sat in the living room, the TV playing quietly in the background. He felt like he was failing on all fronts. He couldn't comfort his grieving daughter, and now he couldn't even control the family dog. The house felt colder than usual, a draft seemingly coming from nowhere. He thought about Storm's behavior. It wasn't malicious, destructive chewing. It was relocation. Why would the dog take the bunny, the blanket, and the inhaler? It felt targeted. It felt personal. Before we find out what happens next, I have a question for you. Have you ever had a pet that started acting strangely, only for you to realize later they were trying to tell you something? Let me know in the comments below. I love reading your animal stories. Mark finished his drink and headed upstairs to check on Lily. She was fast asleep, clutching the recovered Mr. Fluffles. He kissed her forehead, the smell of strawberry shampoo grounding him. He walked down the hall to his own room, exhausted. As he changed into his pajamas, he heard it, a soft scratching sound. Not from the garage. He had let Storm back inside an hour ago because he couldn't stand the howling. The sound was coming from right there, in his bedroom. He froze. The scratching stopped, replaced by a heavy, labored breathing. Mark slowly lowered himself to his knees and lifted the duvet cover hanging over the side of his king-size bed. The space under the bed was dark, usually reserved for storage boxes of winter clothes. Two different colored eyes reflected the hallway light back at him. "Storm?" Mark whispered. The dog didn't come out. He was curled into a tight ball in the far corner against the wall, his body trembling. And he wasn't alone. Surrounded by dust bunnies and darkness, Storm was guarding a massive pile of stolen items. But it wasn't just toys anymore. Mark squinted, reaching for the flashlight on his nightstand. He shone the beam under the bed, and his breath hitched in his throat. There, nestled between Lily's missing coloring books and a stray sock, was something that didn't belong to Lily. It was something that shouldn't have been there at all. Something that made the hair on the back of Mark's neck stand up and sent a shiver of pure primal fear racing down his spine. Storm whined, a high-pitched sound of distress, and placed a protective paw over the pile. He looked at Mark, his eyes pleading, as if to say, "Finally, you see it." Mark's hand trembled as he reached into the darkness under the bed. His fingers brushed against soft fleece, Lily's missing blanket, but as he probed deeper, past the mound of stolen treasures, his hand touched something cold, something stiff. He recoiled, banging his elbow against the bed frame. "Storm, back!" he commanded, his voice tight with a sudden, irrational panic. The dog whimpered, backing away but refusing to leave the room. He sat on his haunches, his blue and brown eyes fixed at Mark with an intensity that felt almost human. Mark grabbed the flashlight and swept the beam fully under the bed. He gasped, the sound sucking the air out of the room. There, nestled between Lily's pink fleece blanket, was a dead rat. It was large, gray, and motionless. But it wasn't bloody. There were no bite marks, no signs of a struggle. It looked as if it had simply curled up and gone to sleep, never to wake up again. And right next to the dead rodent was a piece of charred, melted plastic, a twisted black lump that looked vaguely like the casing of an electrical outlet. "What did you do?" Mark whispered, looking at the dog. But as he pulled the items out into the light, the narrative in his head shifted violently. Storm hadn't killed the rat. If he had, it would be a mess. And where did the burnt plastic come from? He leaned in closer, sniffing the air. The smell hit him then, faint but distinct. It wasn't the smell of a dirty dog or a dead animal. It was the acrid chemical stench of melting insulation and ozone. He looked at the pile of stolen goods again. The bunny, the blanket, the inhaler. He picked up the inhaler. It was covered in a fine, dark soot. He wiped his thumb across it, leaving a charcoal streak on his skin. Mark's heart hammered against his ribs. He looked at Storm. The dog wasn't hiding the items to be naughty. He wasn't acting out of jealousy. Storm let out a sharp, urgent bark and ran to the bedroom door, looking back at Mark, then darting into the hallway toward Lily's room. The realization hit Mark like a physical blow. The dog wasn't stealing from Lily. He was evacuating her. Mark scrambled to his feet, the adrenaline surging through his veins, erasing the fatigue that had plagued him for months. He sprinted into the hallway, the flashlight beam dancing wildly on the walls. Storm was already at Lily's door, scratching frantically at the wood, letting out short, sharp yips. "I'm coming, baby, I'm coming," Mark muttered, his breath coming in short gasps. He grabbed the door handle. It was cool to the touch. He pushed the door open. The room looked peaceful. The nightlight cast a soft pink glow over the princess-themed furniture. Lily was curled up in her bed, a small lump under the duvet. But the moment Mark stepped across the threshold, he felt it. The air was heavy, thick. It wasn't smoke, not yet. It was something more insidious. A heat that didn't belong in a drafty house in October. And underneath the scent of strawberry shampoo and old teddy bears was that smell again. The sharp, stinging odor of burning plastic, stronger now, radiating from the corner of the room. "Lily!" Mark called out, rushing to the bed. She didn't move. Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. He grabbed her shoulders and shook her. "Lily, wake up!" Her head lolled to the side. She was warm, too warm. Her skin was flushed, a deep, unnatural red, and her breathing was shallow, a wheezing rattle in her chest. "No, no, no," Mark begged, pulling her into his arms. She was limp, a dead weight against his chest. He looked wildly for the source. Storm had bounded onto the bed and was sniffing furiously at the wall behind the headbed, the exact spot where Lily's pillow usually rested, the spot where she spent 10 hours a night breathing. Mark shone the flashlight behind the bed frame. There, hidden from view by the bulk of the bed, the electrical outlet was a blackened maw. A cheap, faulty power strip, overloaded with a nightlight, a humidifier, and a tablet charger, had melted into the wall. The drywall around it was scorching hot, the paint blistering and peeling.
It wasn't a fire yet. It was a smolder. A slow, silent burn inside the walls that had been releasing toxic fumes and carbon monoxide directly into his sleeping daughter's face for God knows how long. The dead rat under his bed? Storm must have found it near the wall. The dog knew. The dog had smelled the death in the walls before the sensors ever could. We often think we know best, that our pets are just acting on instinct or misbehaving. But sometimes they are tuned into frequencies we've long since forgotten. It makes you wonder, how many times has your gut told you something was wrong and you ignored it? Let me know in the comments if you've ever had a gut feeling that saved you. Mark coughed, the fumes suddenly catching in his own throat. He had to get her out, now. He scooped Lily up, wrapping the duvet around her. "Storm, go, outside," he roared. The dog didn't need to be told twice. He bolted down the stairs, his nails scrabbling on the hardwood. Mark followed, taking the stairs 2 at a time, clutching his daughter so tight his arms ached. He burst out the front door into the cool night air and collapsed onto the damp grass of the front lawn. "Lily!" He patted her cheek, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "Lily, come on, baby, breathe!" The fresh oxygen hit her lungs. She coughed, a dry, hacking sound, and then took a deep, ragged gasp. Her eyelids fluttered. "Daddy!" she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. "My head hurts." Mark let out a sob that tore from the bottom of his soul. He pulled her against him, burying his face in her hair, rocking back and forth on the lawn. "I know, baby. I know. I've got you. You're safe." Storm paced around them, whining softly, licking Mark's ear and nudging Lily's hand. Mark reached out and buried his hand in the thick fur of the dog. "You saved her," Mark whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I thought you were a thief, but you were a hero." But the night wasn't over. As Mark looked back at the house, he saw a flicker of orange light in Lily's window. The rush of oxygen from the open bedroom door had fed the smoldering embers in the wall. Whoosh! The curtains in Lily's room ignited. The transformation of the house was terrifyingly fast. What began as a flicker in the window grew into a roaring beast within seconds. The smoldering electrical fire, finally fed by the rush of oxygen from the open door, climbed the curtains and licked across the ceiling of Lily's bedroom. Mark scrambled backwards on the lawn, dragging Lily with him, his eyes wide with horror. The glass of the bedroom window shattered, raining shards down onto the patio below. The heat radiated outward, warm against his face despite the chilly October air. "My room!" Lily screamed, burying her face in Mark's chest. "My room is burning!" "It's okay. It's just stuff, Lily. It's just stuff," Mark choked out, though his heart felt like it was being squeezed by a vice. It wasn't just stuff. It was the room that Sarah had painted. It was the rocking chair where she had nursed Lily. It was the last preserved sanctuary of their life before the accident. Storm stood between them and the house, barking ferociously at the flames, his hackles raised. He wasn't barking in aggression. He was barking a warning, a primal sound that echoed through the neighborhood. Lights flickered on in the houses next door. Doors opened. Voices shouted. "Mark! Lily!" It was Mrs. Gable from across the street, running over in her bathrobe. "Oh my God! Are you all right?" "We're out!" Mark gasped, clutching Lily. "We're out!" Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, piercing the crackle of the consuming fire. Mark looked down at Storm, who had stopped barking and was now nudging Lily's leg frantically, whining. Mark realized then that he was still holding the items he had pulled from under the bed. The inhaler was in his pocket, and he had instinctively grabbed the bunny when they ran. But the blanket was still inside, under his bed, next to the evidence of the rat. The fire truck screeched to a halt in front of the house. Firefighters poured out, geared up and moving with practiced urgency. "Everyone out?" a helmeted captain shouted as he rushed toward them. "Yes, just us and the dog," Mark yelled back. As the hoses blasted water into the second-story window, creating a hissing cloud of steam that momentarily swallowed the flames, Mark felt a heavy hand on his shoulder. A paramedic. "Let's check her out," the paramedic said, gesturing to the ambulance. Inside the ambulance, the reality of the night began to crystallize. The paramedic placed an oxygen mask over Lily's nose and mouth. "Her oxygen levels are low," the paramedic said grimly, checking the monitors. "And look at the soot around her nostrils. Carbon monoxide poisoning isn't instant death. It's a silent killer. It builds up. If she had been in that room for another hour..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Mark looked out the back doors of the ambulance. The firefighters were venting the roof now. The fire was contained to the upper floor, specifically Lily's room and the hallway. One of the firefighters, a large man with soot-stained cheeks, walked over to Mark, holding a thermal imaging camera. "You're lucky, sir," the firefighter said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Electrical fire inside the wall. Old wiring. It's been cooking for a while. The insulation melted, releasing toxic fumes long before the flames broke out. Usually, by the time people wake up to the smell of smoke in these cases, it's too late. The gas gets them first." Mark looked down at Storm, who was sitting stoically by the ambulance steps, refusing to leave Lily's side. "The dog knew," Mark whispered. "Sorry?" "The dog," Mark said, his voice cracking. "He was stealing her things, her blanket, her inhalator, her toys. He was taking them out of the room. The firefighter looked at the husky, then back at Mark, a knowing smile touching his lips. Animals sense heat and frequencies we can't. And smells? He probably smelled the melting plastic days ago. He couldn't move the furniture, and he couldn't move the kid without
hurting her, so he started moving what he could. He was clearing the den. It's a wolf instinct. When the den isn't safe, you move the pack. Mark dropped his head into his hands. He had yelled at him. He had banished him to the garage. He had called him a thief. Storm wasn't acting out of jealousy. He was frantically, desperately trying to dismantle the trap his little girl was sleeping in. The stealing was a rescue mission in slow motion. 3 weeks later. The smell of smoke was finally gone from their clothes, though the house was still a skeleton of its former self. Mark and Lily were staying in a rental condo a few miles away, while the contractors gutted the second floor. It was a smaller space, cramped and unfamiliar, but tonight it felt like a palace. Mark sat on the floor of the living room, surrounded by new toys. Mr. Fluffles, surviving the ordeal with a singed ear and a smell of smoke that several washings couldn't quite remove, sat proudly in Lily's lap. "Okay, bedtime," Mark announced. "Can Storm sleep with me?" Lily asked, looking up with big, pleading eyes. In the past, Mark had been strict. No dogs on the bed. It was a rule that Sarah had instituted to keep the shedding under control. But Sarah wasn't here to enforce the rules, and Mark realized that some rules were meant to be broken. Mark looked at the husky. Storm was lying on the rug, chewing contentedly on the new, expensive bone Mark had bought him, a peace offering. "Storm," Mark called Softy. The dog's ears perked up. He trotted over, his nails clicking on the laminate floor. Mark reached out and cupped the dog's face in his hands. He looked into those mismatched eyes, the ice blue and the warm brown, and felt a surge of gratitude, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. "You're a good boy," Mark whispered, pressing his forehead against the dog's snout. "You're the best boy." Storm licked Mark's nose, a quick, rough gesture of forgiveness. "Yes," Mark said, clearing his throat and smiling at his daughter. "Storm can sleep wherever he wants. He's earned it." They walked into the small bedroom. Lily climbed under the covers, tucking Mr. Fluffles in beside her. Storm hopped up effortlessly, circling twice before settling down at the foot of the bed, his heavy head resting on his paws, his eyes fixed on the door. Mark turned off the light, but he didn't leave immediately. He stood in the doorway, watching the silhouette of the dog guarding his daughter. He realized that for the last 6 months, he had been drowning in his own grief, so consumed by the loss of his wife that he had missed the signals right in front of him. He had felt alone in the task of protecting Lily, but he wasn't alone. Sarah might have been gone, but she had left them a guardian. Mark touched the doorframe, a silent vow forming in his heart. He would listen better now. He would pay attention to the warnings, the instincts, the silent nudges of the universe. He would trust the love that existed in this broken, beautiful little family. "Good night, Daddy," Lily mumbled, already half asleep. "Good night, sweetheart. Good night, Storm." A soft thump of a tail against the mattress was the only reply he needed. They were safe. They were together. And as Mark closed the door, he knew that no matter what fires life threw at them next, they would face them as a pack. It's incredible to think about the silent bonds we share with our pets. They don't speak our language, yet they communicate with a love that is louder than words. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of a loyal friend in your own life, please share it with someone you love. And tell me in the comments, what is the smartest or most protective thing your pet has ever done for you? I read every single story.